And they've done some studies again to reinforce the contribution and how important this aspect is to overall performance, if you like, or completing a task such as passing. So in the EPL, they've had ISO cams on certain players where they've looked at how often they've scanned and looked away from the ball. So again, picking up information perceptually by scanning, looking away as Lampard's doing here. And they want to know what impact does that have on quality of player, I suppose, and also forward pass completion. So again, they found the best players do this more often. Okay, so they're picking up more information. They're also obviously able to interpret that information and understand what they're seeing. And the critical one was probably highly correlated to forward pass completion. So in soccer, a forward pass is generally really valuable. So to be able to complete those is a good thing. And the more you scan, guess what? The higher the completion. So again, I know in Aussie rules particularly, if you talked about kicking effectiveness or passing completion, and if it's poor, your first instinct is it's a motor skill problem. It needs to get out and do more repetition of technique or close kicking. Well, that's not often the case. Equally as often, if not more so, it's to do with perceptual cognitive skills. So they play a massive role in how effectively then the motor skill is implemented. And that I've already alluded to. I think that's underrated or overlooked too often in our training in particular. So how can it be acquired? Or first, maybe even can it be acquired? So there's probably been some beliefs for a fair while that you're born with it, it's in your genes, it's in your blood, some chip that gets inserted from birth. Well, we know that, genetics play a contributing factor, and it's not yet known exactly how all that works, but it's certainly not the main factor in developing decision-making abilities. In fact, someone yesterday just said about you just can't teach it, and that's technically true, but it can be learned. So we know that that's myth. So instead, how is it acquired? Well, just like anything, it's through experiences. So the old saying, you learn from your experiences, and that's the case. From young ages all the way through, we learn from our experiences, and learning is really about the brain rewiring itself based on those experiences that you have. Okay, and we know now that doesn't just happen through childhood. This happens all through life. They call it neural plasticity. Your brain can rewire itself and learn up to 70, 80 years of age plus. It's an ongoing process. And that's been, I guess, a mechanism that's been part of mankind for a long time to allow them to adapt to their environment. So back in the day, the caveman that used to have to go out and hunt and gather and used to have to watch out for the saber-toothed tiger on the savannah, okay, he was having to make decisions all the time, having to learn pretty quickly, otherwise he wasn't going to survive. So it's like a survival mechanism that allowed him to adapt to his environment. Of course, if there were grocery stores around in his day, he wouldn't have learnt how to do that. It would have been like us. We've learnt how to hop in the car, drive down to the grocery store, grab something off the shelf, pay for it, drive back home, eat. That's the skills we've learnt through our experiences, okay? So all through experiences, and they alluded to it in the Ronaldo video as well, in terms of how he's acquired those. They called it practice. It's not necessarily our view of practice, which is organised and coach-led. It can be from hundreds and thousands of hours of experiences he's had from a young child. And experiences that generally simulate the real game, as in, they've got decision-making in them and they require some game intelligence. They're not just these closed motor skills. And so one of those, maybe you've already sort of thought of this from early ages, and the research sort of shows in terms of developmental history, is street, pick-up, backyard, park games play a massive role in developing decision-making expertise in top-level players. From real young ages, these type of experiences end up, a lot of the times, creating good decision-makers. So what's called deliberate play, or what we just call, pick-up games probably, in a variety of team sports. That's a real common element. You might know players yourself if you know their history that have got a background there. And obviously Brazilian football is, the street football is hugely prominent. So that's often a common trait of the best decision makers in their history. And that's relevant for later on. And as I said, the research also questions whether coach-led practice, organised practice sessions, say once you get into your youth in particular and upwards, how much that actually contributes. Because often we see this, and what's the problem with this shot? Cones. Any decisions being made? No. So often we just don't expose players to it, again, because we're fascinated or caught up in the motor skill aspect and we forget about the perceptual cognitive skills. So again, research suggests that sometimes the amount of this type of practice doesn't really differentiate between the experts. And the other thing that's really important is any environment, whether it is that play environment or whether it is in practice and coach-led, is it's got to be safe, because decisions are learnt and game intelligence and creativity is learnt through trial and error, through stuffing up. And players have got to feel safe to do that. Okay, and there's a lot of situations where that's not the case, starting from real young right up to adult players. So if you're going to develop this, there needs to be an environment where they're able to make, trial and error and feel safe to make some mistakes and learn from those. And finally, there's some suggestion as well that multi-sport participation can play a role. So I said, maybe it needs to simulate the real game, but perhaps some team sports have similarities that do transfer. So
I like this. Oh, he got it!
So obviously that's not necessarily decision making, but reflects Nash's soccer background. And I've just read this morning he claimed he probably could have been a professional soccer player as well. So again, challenging that notion of early specialisation, that we have to start at 8 years of age specialising in one sport. And the other guy is Pendlebury, who we mentioned earlier, the best decision maker in the AFL, as Ash could tell us about, played basketball all through his youth years, didn't really even play AFL at all, came back to AFL around 18 when he was drafted. He's now the best decision maker in the game. So there's some evidence there that cross-sport participation could be involved as well in developing expertise.